Not everyone who smiles at you feels warmth. And not everyone who goes quiet around you dislikes you for the reason you think. Some reactions are not about who you are, but about what you unknowingly activate in others. The strange part? The traits people react to most are often the ones you don't see in yourself. And that's where the real tension begins. Have you ever walked into a room and felt a shift you couldn't explain? No insult, no argument, just subtle distance. Or said something harmless, only to notice someone becoming colder than expected. It feels personal, but often it isn't. What you're witnessing is not judgment of your actions alone, but a psychological mirror being held up in real time. People don't just see you, they interpret you through their own hidden emotional landscape. People rarely respond to another person in a purely objective way. Instead, they interact with a psychological interpretation constructed in real time from memory, emotion, and unresolved inner material. When someone says they dislike a trait in another person, what they are often describing is the activation of something already present within themselves, but not consciously acknowledged. This is why two people can witness the same behavior and have entirely opposite reactions. One may see confidence as inspiring, while another perceives it as arrogance, even though the external behavior has not changed. The difference lies in what each observer carries internally. The mind continuously compares external signals with internal narratives, especially those tied to self-worth, identity, and past experience. If a person has suppressed ambition, they may feel discomfort around those who express it openly, not because ambition itself is threatening, but because it highlights a denied aspect of their own potential. This creates an unconscious defense mechanism where the observer reinterprets the other person in a way that reduces internal tension. Instead of recognizing, "This reflects something I haven't developed," the mind prefers, "This person is excessive or unlikable." Over time, this pattern becomes automatic, shaping social perception without awareness. What feels like being judged or subtly disliked is often this internal negotiation projected outward, where others are unknowingly managing their own emotional discomfort through interpretation of you, rather than directly confronting it internally, which means the reaction you receive is less about your actual behavior and more about how efficiently their mind processes what your presence represents in that moment of psychological reflection unfolding beneath their awareness. Especially when there is no language available to accurately describe the discomfort that emerges in relational space between perception and self-image, forming subtle emotional distortions that shape interaction itself unconsciously. Projection is one of the most subtle but powerful mechanisms shaping how people interpret each other, because it operates below conscious awareness and feels like observation, even when it is partly self-reflection. When someone projects, they are not inventing qualities out of nowhere. They are taking an inner trait, emotion, or impulse that they have difficulty recognizing in themselves and perceiving it as if it belongs primarily to another person. The mind does this to preserve psychological stability. If a feeling is uncomfortable, contradictory to self-image, or socially unacceptable, it becomes easier to locate it externally than to integrate it internally. So instead of saying, "I feel insecure in this situation," a person may experience the other as intimidating. Instead of acknowledging envy, they may interpret the other as showing off. The external label becomes a container for something internal that has no safe place in awareness. This process becomes even stronger in social interactions, where identity is constantly being compared. People unconsciously scan others for cues that confirm or threaten their own self-concept. When a trait appears in someone else that is either suppressed or underdeveloped within them, it creates a kind of psychological tension. Projection resolves that tension quickly by relocating the trait outward and attaching judgment to it. This is why projection often carries emotional intensity disproportionate to the actual behavior observed. The reaction is not just about what is seen, but about what is stirred internally and then displaced. Over time, projection can distort relationships without either person realizing it. The one being projected onto may feel misread or unfairly categorized, while the one projecting feels completely justified in their interpretation. Yet both are interacting with a blended reality, part external behavior, part internal reflection. What makes projection so persistent is that it often feels like clarity rather than distortion, because the mind experiences its own interpretations as direct perception rather than psychological construction shaped by inner conflict, memory, and emotional residue accumulating beneath awareness, subtly guiding social meaning without explicit recognition of its origin. The persona is the social identity a person builds to function in the world, a kind of psychological interface between inner life and external expectation. It is not inherently false, but it is selective. It highlights certain traits, suppresses others, and organizes behavior in a way that is acceptable, rewarded, or safe within a given environment. Over time, people become so accustomed to operating through this layer that they begin to identify with it as their whole self, even though it is only a fraction of their total psychological reality. The tension arises when this constructed social self becomes too rigid or too carefully managed, because other people are remarkably sensitive to incongruence, even when they cannot articulate what they are sensing. When the persona is overly polished, it can create a subtle discomfort in others, not because it is wrong, but because it feels controlled or emotionally inaccessible. Human perception is tuned not only to words and actions, but also to spontaneity, imperfection, and emotional transparency. When everything appears too calculated, it can trigger suspicion or distance, as if something essential is being withheld. This does not necessarily lead to conscious dislike, but it can reduce warmth and increase psychological distance. People may describe it as feeling hard to read or not fully genuine, even if the behavior is technically polite and appropriate. On the other hand, when someone lacks a stable persona and shifts too much depending on context, it creates a different kind of friction. Others may struggle to form a coherent impression, leading to uncertainty or mistrust. The mind prefers patterns it can predict, and inconsistency disrupts that need for cognitive stability. So the persona functions as a necessary bridge, but when it becomes either too rigid or too fluid, it alters how others emotionally regulate themselves in your presence. What is often interpreted as social reaction is actually the nervous system responding to perceived psychological coherence or lack of it, rather than conscious evaluation of character or intention, shaping relational tone in subtle but persistent ways over time, without explicit awareness of its influence on interaction dynamics. Shadow discomfort refers to the subtle psychological irritation that appears when one person's traits unintentionally highlight something another person has disowned or not fully developed within themselves. It does not require any direct comparison or competition. It happens automatically through perception. When someone embodies a quality with ease, such as confidence, emotional stability, discipline, or even directness, it can unconsciously activate awareness in others of their own difficulty with that same quality. The mind then experiences a tension between recognition and resistance. Recognition says, "I see this quality clearly in you," while resistance says, "I do not want to feel what this implies about me." This internal conflict is often uncomfortable, so the psyche seeks relief by shifting attention away from self-reflection. One of the easiest ways to do that is to reinterpret the source of discomfort externally. Instead of acknowledging internal lack or insecurity, the mind assigns meaning to the other person's behavior, often framing it as excessive, unnecessary, or even irritating. What is actually being reacted to is not the trait itself, but the contrast it creates. The stronger the contrast between someone's expressed quality and another person's suppressed or underdeveloped version of it, the stronger the emotional reaction can become. This is why confidence, in particular, can be polarizing. In someone who feels internally grounded, confidence appears calm and neutral. In someone who feels uncertain, it can appear aggressive or performative, even when no aggression exists. The perception is filtered through emotional readiness rather than objective observation. The shadow is essentially the collection of traits a person has not integrated into their conscious identity. And when those traits are expressed openly by another, it creates a mirror effect that is difficult to ignore. The discomfort does not always lead to hostility. Sometimes it manifests as withdrawal, sarcasm, quiet comparison, or subtle devaluation. These reactions are attempts to reduce internal imbalance without confronting it directly. Over time, repeated exposure to someone who embodies a disowned trait can either lead to admiration or irritation, depending on whether the observer moves toward integration or further avoidance, shaping relational dynamics in ways that are often invisible but deeply influential in everyday social perception and emotional response patterns across interactions that feel personal but are largely psychological in origin rather than factual judgment of character itself. If this perspective is hitting something familiar, pause for a moment and reflect. Which reactions around you might be about projection, and which might actually be feedback worth hearing? And if you want, you can go deeper into this, understanding how unconscious social dynamics shape confidence, relationships, and perception far more than words ever do. Inconsistency between words, tone, and energy creates a form of cognitive friction in others, because human beings rely heavily on pattern recognition to feel safe in social environments. When what is said aligns clearly with how it is said and how it feels, the mind experiences coherence and relaxes. But when there is a mismatch, such as polite words delivered with tense energy, confidence expressed with anxious undertones, or friendliness that feels slightly forced, the observer's nervous system begins to register uncertainty even if they cannot explain why. This uncertainty is often interpreted as distrust, discomfort, or subtle dislike, but at its core, it is a response to ambiguity. The human brain constantly builds predictive models of other people. It asks, consciously or not, what kind of person is this, and what will they do next? Consistency strengthens these models, making behavior easier to predict and therefore easier to emotionally regulate. Inconsistency weakens them, forcing the mind into heightened attention. That increased attention can feel like suspicion, even when there is no rational reason for it. The other person may not consciously think something is wrong, but they will often feel slightly unsettled, guarded, or less open. Tone and energy carry more psychological weight than words because they are harder to fake consistently. Words belong to the rational layer of communication, while tone and energy belong to emotional signaling. When these layers do not match, people tend to trust the deeper signal over the verbal one. For example, someone might say they are fine, but if their tone feels withdrawn or their energy feels heavy, others will respond to that underlying signal rather than the statement itself. This can lead to misinterpretation, where intentions are judged based on emotional output instead of verbal content. Over time, repeated exposure to inconsistency reduces trust, not necessarily in a moral sense, but in a predictive sense. People may not label it as dislike, but they will naturally limit emotional openness because the interaction feels harder to read. The discomfort arises from the effort required to interpret mixed signals, and the mind often resolves that effort by creating distance rather than continuing to decode ambiguity in social perception and interaction dynamics that depend heavily on subtle alignment between internal state and external expression, shaping relational ease or resistance unconsciously across everyday encounters. Over-adaptation, often seen as people-pleasing or excessive social adjustment, creates a subtle but persistent form of relational tension, because it distorts the natural exchange of signals between two people. At its core, human interaction depends on mutual presence, each person registering the other's authentic responses in real time. When someone over-adapts, they begin prioritizing anticipated expectations over their immediate inner state, continuously adjusting tone, opinions, humor, and emotional expression to maintain approval or avoid conflict. While this may seem socially effective on the surface, it introduces an undercurrent of instability in how they are perceived. The reason for this tension is that people are highly sensitive to authenticity, even when they cannot define it precisely. Over-adaptation often produces a kind of social smoothness that feels slightly hollow, as if nothing sharp or real is present to anchor the interaction. The person becomes agreeable, but predictably so, and this predictability is not rooted in consistency of self, but in responsiveness to external cues. Subconsciously, others may sense that the individual is not fully grounded in their own perspective, which reduces the feeling of relational depth. Instead of encountering a defined presence, they encounter a shape that adjusts itself too quickly to the surrounding environment. This creates confusion in perception. Some may initially like the person because there is no friction, but over time, emotional engagement weakens because there is little resistance or individuality to interact with. Without points of difference, moments where someone asserts a stable preference or boundary, the relationship lacks texture. Human psychology often requires a balance between agreement and distinctness to maintain interest and respect. Too much adaptation removes that balance and replaces it with compliance that can feel unintentionally impersonal. There is also an internal consequence. The more a person adapts outwardly, the less they reinforce their own internal signals, which can weaken their sense of identity over time. This creates a feedback loop where external approval becomes necessary for emotional stability, further increasing adaptive behavior. Others may not consciously label this as discomfort, but they may respond with reduced trust, emotional distance, or a sense that the interaction is pleasant yet not fully engaging, because what they are experiencing is responsiveness without grounded presence, shaping the relational field in a way that lacks clear psychological edges or stable internal direction across time. Authenticity is often misunderstood as simply being real. But psychologically, it is closer to the alignment between inner experience and outer expression, without excessive distortion for approval or avoidance. When a person becomes more authentic in this deeper sense, something interesting happens socially. They become less universally agreeable, but more clearly defined in the minds of others. This definition is what makes authenticity polarizing, because the human mind prefers what it can categorize easily, even if it does not fully agree with it. When someone expresses themselves with clarity, clear preferences, stable emotional tone, and honest reactions, they reduce ambiguity in social perception. This allows others to quickly sense where they stand with that person. For some, this clarity feels refreshing because it removes guesswork and creates psychological safety through predictability. For others, it feels confronting because it removes the flexibility they may unconsciously use to project their own expectations onto that person. When there is less ambiguity, there is less room for reinterpretation, and the mind loses the ability to reshape the person into something more comfortable. This is where rejection can emerge alongside attraction. Authentic expression naturally filters social alignment. People who resonate with your unfiltered way of being tend to move closer, while those who cannot integrate it tend to create distance. This separation is not necessarily personal dislike, but a form of psychological sorting based on compatibility of perception and values. However, from the inside, it can feel like being misunderstood or subtly rejected, especially when one is transitioning from adaptive behavior to more grounded self-expression. Another layer of this polarity comes from contrast. Authentic individuals often stop performing unnecessary social smoothing, which can make emotional responses more visible. That visibility can be misinterpreted as intensity or rigidity by those accustomed to more moderated social behavior. In reality, what changes is not emotional extremity, but transparency of it. This transparency forces others to respond more honestly as well, which can be uncomfortable if they are used to low-friction interactions where nothing is clearly challenged or affirmed. Over time, authenticity stabilizes relationships that remain, but reduces the number of superficial connections. What feels like being less liked is often the process of becoming more specifically aligned with fewer people, where connection is based on resonance rather than adaptability, shaping a social field that is narrower but more structurally honest and psychologically coherent in the long term, across evolving interpersonal dynamics and perceived social acceptance patterns. Most social tension that feels personal is actually happening below the level of conscious awareness, which is why it often seems confusing or disproportionate to what was actually said or done. People tend to assume that reactions are deliberate judgments, but in reality, a large portion of them are automatic responses shaped by emotional memory, internal beliefs, and unprocessed experiences. When someone interacts with you, they are not only perceiving your current behavior, but also filtering it through a long accumulation of past associations that influence how safe, comfortable, or threatened they feel in your presence. This unconscious processing means that two people can experience the same interaction in completely different ways, without either of them being intentionally dishonest or biased in a conscious sense. One person might feel warmth and ease, while another might feel slight resistance or withdrawal, even though the external situation appears identical. The difference lies in internal emotional architecture rather than objective reality. Subtle cues like tone, pacing, facial expression, or even silence can activate these internal patterns faster than rational thought can intervene, producing immediate feelings that are only later justified with explanations that sound logical, but are actually constructed after the emotional response has already occurred. Much of what is interpreted as social judgment or dislike is actually emotional self-regulation happening through perception. If someone feels internally uncertain, they may experience clarity in another person as discomfort. If they feel insecure, they may interpret neutrality as rejection. These interpretations are not conscious decisions, but stabilizing mechanisms that help reduce internal tension by assigning meaning to external signals. This is why explanations for social discomfort often feel rational, even when they are rooted in emotional reflex rather than factual analysis. Because of this, social reality is partially co-created by the nervous systems of everyone involved. Each person is continuously adjusting, reacting, and reinterpreting in real time, creating a shared field of perception that feels objective but is actually highly subjective beneath the surface. What appears as being judged or not liked is often just this invisible exchange of internal states being translated into social meaning without awareness of its origin, resulting in experiences that feel interpersonal but are largely intrapersonal processes projected outward into shared interaction space, shaping how connection is felt rather than what is explicitly intended or expressed verbally in the moment. In the end, what feels like being judged, disliked, or subtly pushed away is rarely as direct or intentional as the mind first assumes. Most of it unfolds in layers that sit beneath awareness, where projection, emotional memory, internal insecurity, and unconscious comparison quietly shape how others experience your presence. People are not responding to a fixed version of you, but to a constantly shifting interpretation built from their own inner world meeting your outward expression. This means social reality is never purely about who you are in isolation. It is always an interaction between your presence and the psychological material others carry into that encounter. The same trait in you can create admiration in one person and discomfort in another, not because the trait changes, but because the observer's internal structure changes how that trait is received. Much of what is labeled as personality judgment is actually emotional translation happening in real time. When persona, projection, shadow discomfort, inconsistency, over-adaptation, and authenticity all come together, they reveal a consistent pattern. People do not experience each other directly, they experience each other through filters. These filters decide what is amplified, what is ignored, and what becomes emotionally charged. And because these filters operate silently, the conclusions people reach about each other often feel absolute, even when they are deeply subjective. Understanding this does not eliminate social tension, but it changes the way it is interpreted. What once looked like rejection becomes a mixture of perception, psychology, and unconscious response. What once felt personal becomes less fixed and more fluid. And in that space of awareness, you stop reducing every reaction to a verdict on your worth, and instead begin to see it as part of a much larger psychological exchange that no single person fully controls, but everyone participates in shaping through the quiet mechanics of the mind operating beneath everyday interaction.